Hello students, welcome to Zoology Classroom. This is L. Mahesh, Assistant Professor of Zoology from Dhara Government College, Sangareddy. Today we are going to discuss about control of respiration. This particular topic comes under BSc Final Year Zoology semester. So before entering into the topic, let us once again recapitulate what is respiration. Respiration is a biochemical process by which all living organisms will get energy from the food. We know that for the survival of the organisms, they require energy, and that energy comes from the food they eat. So the energy which is present inside the food will be released by this a biochemical process. That process is called as respiration. So usually in this process, what's happening? The food molecules or food particles which participate in the energy releasing process are called as substrates. So the C6H12O6, this is glucose molecule, this is the substrate. So this glucose molecule, by reacting with oxygen, it gives rise to carbon dioxide molecule, water molecule, and ATP molecule. So these ATP molecules are the form of energy that our body can utilize. So to give rise to or to release the energy in the form of ATP, the food molecule or substrate has to react with oxygen. So this process is called as oxidization of food materials. So this oxidization of food materials to release the energy is called as respiration process. So we know that as the complex organisms, as they have got a bigger size bodies, for this purpose of respiration, they have developed special systems which help in this process. Those special systems are respiratory system, and this respiratory system, it sends oxygen into blood, and it receives carbon dioxide from the blood and sends to the exterior. That is the purpose of respiratory system. So in performing this function, the respiratory system undergoes two phases. They are inspiration and expiration. We may also call them as inhalation and exhalation. In other words, we can also say that breathing in and breathing out. So these processes, in these processes, our lungs, our total respiratory system will participate. So for the functioning of these two phases, that means breathing in or breathing and breathing out. So mainly two muscle cells will function in this process. They are intercostal muscles and diaphragmatic muscles. So due to the movements in these muscle cells only, our lungs are able to breathe in, and they are able to breathe out, or uh, they are able to perform expiration, exhalation. So this breathing is nothing but it is also called as exchange of gases. It is a process by which exchange of gases takes place, and this process requires the proper movements of proper functioning of proper contractions, relaxations of these two muscles, that is intercostal muscles which are present between the ribs and diaphragm muscles. Due to the movement of these two muscles only, our lung is able to expand during the inspiration phase, and again it is able to contract or become small in size during the expiration process. So the today's topic is that control of respiration. Control of respiration refers to the control of these respiratory movements. So when these respiratory movements are undergoing normally, So our body also will function normally. But when there is a problem in the when there is a situation arises in the concentration of oxygen, that may be a lower concentration or increased carbon dioxide concentration. So when these two type of conditions arise, then what happens? Our breathing movements also will change accordingly to cope up with this situation or to bring the normalcy in our body. So in this way, a control mechanism should be there. If there is no control mechanism over these respiratory movements, when there is a situation arises when low oxygen or hypoxia condition is there, there would be a possibility of uh, dying of the individual organism. So in this way, control of respiration refers to the control of the respiratory movements. And not only respiratory movements are important in this respiration process, the blood circulation also plays very, very important role. Why? Because when we are facing a hypoxia condition is when our tissues or our cells are having low oxygen content. So when they are low of oxygen content, that condition is called as hypoxia. So during the hypoxia condition, what happens? Our cells are in uh, urgent need of oxygen. So to supply the oxygen in high quantities, blood has to mm, uh, blood has to be perfused uh, more than the normal conditions to the tissues. So that means blood circulation also has to be changed accordingly. When there is a need of oxygen, blood circulation has to be increased. So blood circulation is a result of the pumping of the heartbeat. So that's why heartbeat functioning also plays a very, very important role in the respiration. So that's why when situations are normal in our body, blood, respiratory movements and functioning of heart also will be normal. There will be no problem. But when a hypoxia condition arises, our respiratory movements also they will increase. In other words, respiratory rate will be increased, and accordingly, the blood circulation rate or heartbeat rate or blood pressure also has to be increased. So in this way, depending on the situations, to control the respiration, it means to control the respiratory movements and to control the blood circulation also. So how these processes are done, we will see in today's. So this control of respiration can be categorized into three types. One is local control, and one is peripheral control, and third one is central control. And in local control, again, the local control, especially these lungs, will be participating and in this local control. So bronchioles, alveoli, and capillaries will participate in local control mechanism. So coming to the peripheral control, there are chemoreceptors are there in our body. So these chemoreceptors, they will participate in peripheral control mechanisms. And in third category, central control mechanisms, our central nervous system, especially our brain. Some parts are there in our brain. Those parts, those special parts like nuclei in pons and medulla, cerebral cortex, these two mechanisms. So nuclei in pons and medulla and cerebral cortex, these will control the respiratory movement. So this is called as central control. So in this way, totally three control mechanisms are there to control the respiration: local control, peripheral control, and central control. So let us know about this local control mechanisms. So in local control mechanisms, two activities are very, very important. One is lung perfusion. Second one is alveolar ventilation. So what is perfusion? Perfusion is nothing but the blood flow. So blood flow in the lungs is called as lung perfusion. So depending on the situation, the lung perfusion uh, has to be low at some sometimes, and it has to be increased during the certain situations. So when normal conditions are there, perfusion should be normal. So depending on the demand or not necessity, the vasoconstriction or vasodilations will take place in the lungs. So this vasoconstriction and vasodilations, they will control the respiratory movement. So during vasoconstriction, what happens? Arterioles will become shortened in their diameter. So a shortening of diameter of the arterioles results in the low oxygen supply. So vasoconstriction will be done during those conditions when body is not required a lot of oxygen. So when there is no requirement of oxygen, when there is no much requirement of oxygen, under those circumstances, blood circulation, blood pumping to the lungs will be decreased due to the vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction is nothing but constriction of the blood vessels in the lungs is called as vasoconstriction. So this vasoconstriction automatically it reduces the blood supply. Then automatically when there is a low blood supply, low oxygen supply also will be there. So low oxygen supply, when it will be arise that question, the situation when body is not having a problem with oxygen content. But at certain times, like when we are doing rigorous work or exercises like that, when we are escaping from a tiger or like that, under those circumstances, what happens? Our cells are in high demand of oxygen. So under those circumstances, vasodilation takes place to increase this partial pressure of oxygen. In second activity, alveolar ventilation. So bronchodilation means dilation in the bronchioles. So during the dilation of bronchioles, automatically carbon dioxide, high carbon dioxide conditions. When high carbon dioxide conditions arise, bronchodilation takes place to send this carbon dioxide to outside. And bronchoconstriction takes place when there is a low carbon dioxide inside our body. So when there is low carbon dioxide inside our body, bronchoconstriction takes place. So depending on the situation, so when there is low oxygen supply, vasoconstriction takes place. And when there is a high oxygen, vasodilation takes place. In the same way, when there is high carbon dioxide is there, uh, bronchodilation takes place, and when there is low carbon dioxide there inside our body, uh, bronchoconstriction takes place. In this way, alveolar ventilation also will be controlled by the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations or partial pressures inside our body. So this is called as local control. So depending on the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations or partial pressures. So depending on the oxygen concentrations, lung perfusion will be controlled either by vasoconstriction or by vasodilation. And depending on the concentration of carbon dioxide, alveolar ventilation is controlled by bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction. So these two categories of activities are considered as local control. So in this thing, the ventilation and perfusion, two things are there. So ventilation is mentioned with capital V letter. So what is ventilation? The amount of oxygen reaching alveoli is called as ventilation, and this is measured in liters per minute. So under normal ventilation conditions, under normal situations, per each minute, 4 liters of air enters into our lungs. So that is 4 liters per minute is the normal ventilation. And perfusion. So perfusion is the amount of blood flow into the lungs, and this is also measured in liters per minute units. So normal perfusion is 5 liters per blood per minute. So 5 liters of blood will be enters into the lungs during the normal condition. So to decide the how the respiratory demand is there inside our body, this ventilation by perfusion ratio, P by Q ratio, is very very important. So the ratio between this amount of air entering into the alveoli and the amount of blood draining into the lung is called as ventilation by perfusion ratio. So this ratio allows us an assessment of the efficacy of gas exchange. So depending on this ratio, V by Q ratio, we can assess the efficiency of gas exchange, how the gas exchange B is being taking place inside our lungs. We can come to one conclusion about this point, depending on this ventilation and perfusion ratio. So under normal conditions, ventilation by perfusion, V by Q is equal to 4 by 5. So that would be around 0. So normal respiratory, under normal respiratory conditions, V by Q ratio will be 0.8. But in some situations, what happens, this normal respiratory conditions may not prevail. So, for example, when ventilation exceeds perfusion, so that then what happens? High V value will be there than Q value. So normally V value will be 4 and Q value will be 5. So 4 by 5 will be normal V by Q value is equal to 0.8. But when ventilation exceeds perfusion ratio, what happens? V value exceeds the Q value. So then V by Q value will be more than 1 or more than 0.8. So when high V by Q value is there, what happens? A lot of gases or oxygen is entering into the lungs, but that oxygen is not able to enter into our body. So inability of oxygenization takes place during this high V by Q value. In other words, when inability of oxygenization taking place inside our body, high V by Q value will result. So this condition normally can be seen during emphysema condition. So emphysema is a condition where ventilation is good, but uh, oxygenization of blood is not good. So that's why perfusion ratio, when perfusion ratio is below the normal levels, then what happens? High V by Q value results in this condition is called as emphysema. So, and in some other situations, no perfusion will be there. No perfusion may result in due to the pulmonary embolus. So, when blood vessels in the lungs, they have got a embolus inside them. That embolus obstructs the entry of blood into the lung. So in that way, what happens? Q value will be 0. So when Q value will be 0, then what happens? That results in this pulmonary embolus, and that is a very very dangerous condition. Why? Because when there is no blood supply to the lungs, oxygenization will not take place. When oxygenization is not taking place, the tissues will not get oxygen. So that will result in the death of the individual. So Q value when it equals to 0 also, that is a very very dangerous condition. And low V by Q value, that means ventilation is poor, but blood circulation is good. So under those circumstances, V by Q value will be low, very low. That means it will be below 0.8. So this condition arises during asthma condition and chronic bronchitis and pulmonary edema conditions. Low V by Q value will be arising. So in this type of disease, disease conditions, we can see this low V by Q value and that diseases resulted due to the poor ventilation condition. And some other fourth condition is when no air enters the alveoli. So blood circulation is good, but blood perfusion is good. Q value is normal, but V is equal to 0. That means the air is not entering into the lungs at all. So this condition arises during deoxygenated atelectasis and pneumonia conditions. So when pneumonia condition and deoxygenated atelectasis conditions, during these conditions, air cannot enter into the alveoli. When there is no entry of oxygen or air into the alveoli, blood cannot receive oxygen. So these two conditions, V is equal to 0 condition or Q is equal to 0 condition, both these two conditions, they will kill the animal or person within minutes. Whereas a high VYQ value is not a big issue, but poor ventilation also, it is somewhat problematic condition. So depending on these conditions, respiratory movements will be controlled. So now coming to second type of control, there is central control. So in central control, our central nervous system plays a very, very important role in central control of breathing or respiratory movements. So this respiratory control of control of respiratory movements by central nervous system can be classified into two categories. One is involuntary control and second one is voluntary control. So in involuntary control, what happens, the involuntary control center is present inside the medulla oblongata and pons feruli. So this voluntary control center is located in the cerebral cortex. So cerebral cortex voluntary control means we willingly we will control our breathing movements. So that condition or that will our consciousness center is present in the cerebral cortex. That's why voluntary control is said to present in cerebral cortex. Where coming to involuntary control, it directs the depth and rate of breathing via outputs from the respiratory center. So in this involuntary control centers, respiratory centers are present in the medulla oblongata and pons feruli. These two centers, they will control the depth of the respiratory movements and the rate of the respiratory movements or rate of breathing. And these respiratory centers, they will modify the respiratory movements depending on the feedback coming from other sides. So depending on other sides, that means peripheral control also will influences the involuntary control mechanism. Then coming to voluntary control mechanism. So this voluntary center, which is present in the cerebral cortex, this voluntary center sends impulses to the respiratory motor neurons via corticospinal tracts. So, and these influential factors, they will include emotion and pain. So during certain conditions of emotion and some pain conditions, our cerebral cortex, the center of voluntary control in cerebral cortex becomes activated. It sends impulses to the respiratory motor neurons via corticospinal tracts. These corticospinal tracts, then they will control the respiratory movement. And coming to this respiratory centers which are present in this involuntary control are pons feruli and medulla oblongata. So in the pons feruli, in the pons respiratory centers, two respiratory centers are present in the pons feruli. One is a pneumotoxic center. This is pneumotoxic center. And the second one is anoustic center. Pneumotoxic and anoustic centers are present in the pons feruli. So they are considered as pons respiratory centers. And in the medulla oblongata, we have a dorsal respiratory group or dorsal respiratory center. and another one is ventral respiratory center, the ventral respiratory group. So apart from these two groups, another one is their pre-Boschinger complex. Pre-Boschinger complex also there. These three centers are present in the medulla oblongata. They are called as medullary respiratory centers. So in this way, these two centers, they will control involuntary respiratory movements. So coming to the arrangement of this pre-Boschinger complex, so this pre-Boschinger complex is very, very important. It acts as a pacemaker. It generates the respiratory signals required for the respiratory movement. So respiratory movements usually they will occur rhythmically. So the rhythmic respiratory movements will get signals from this pre-Boschinger complex. And it is present in the medulla oblongata as we have already seen in previous diagram. So here this is the medulla oblongata. In this medulla oblongata we have this pre-Boschinger complex in this thing. So the arrangement of pre-Boschinger complex. Near to this thing, this is present in between two nuclei. One is called as nuclei ambiguous, and the second one is lateral reticular nucleus, LRN. Lateral reticular nucleus is one. Another one is NA, nucleus ambiguous. So in between these two nuclei, this pre-Boschinger complex is present, and this pre-Boschinger complex generates the signals for this normal rhythmic respiratory movements. So, and dorsal group of neurons are dorsal respiratory group, which is present in the medullary oblongata. It fires in bursts. So, and this DRG controls the passive expiration process. So the fires coming from this, fire bursts coming from this DRG, they will control the inspiratory movement in these muscles, the two muscles, that is intercostal muscles and the diaphragmatic muscles. They will be triggered by this fire in bursts generated from this dorsal respiratory group. So in this way, dorsal respiratory group is responsible for the inspiratory movements. So inspiration is resulting due to the activity of dorsal respiratory group. And coming to the function of ventral respiratory group or VRG, ventral respiratory group, these cells which are present in this ventral respiratory group, both they are having inspiratory and expiratory fibers. That means they will control both the movements, inspiratory and expiratory. So when the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, when they increase firing, then what happens? These ventral respiratory neurons also, they will become activated, and they excite the expiratory muscles in the intercostals and abdominal muscles and this diaphragmatic muscle. So these VRG cells, they will augment or they will increase both the inspiratory movements and expiratory movements. So coming to this centers which are present in this pneumotoxic pons viruli. So there are two centers, pneumotoxic center and second one is a neurogenic center. And this DRG, as we have already just discussed, this dorsal respiratory group, it controls inspiratory movements through vagus nerve. And whereas this ventral respiratory group, this ventral respiratory group controls the both the activities through this respiratory motor pathways. Both the activities means respiratory and inspiration movements are controlled by this ventral respiratory movement. Now let us know about this pneumotoxic center and anesthetic center activities. So this pneumotoxic center is present in this pons viruli part or pontine respiratory group. So this pneumotoxic center, it sends the impulses which inhibit inspiration. So pneumotoxic center, inhibits the inspiratory movements, and it promotes passive or active exhalation. So it controls the inspiration movement, and it cannot control the exhalation process. And it also inhibits the aneuptic center. So pneumotoxic center inhibits the activity of aneuptic center. And when there are lesions in this pneumotoxic center, what happens? Respiration rate will be slower. So low respiratory activity will be there. So that means breathing problem will be there. The person cannot breathe properly. And that also leads to the increased tidal volumes. And coming to the aneuptic center, so the signals from this or impulses from this aneuptic center, they will excite the inspiratory area of the medulla. So they will control this dorsal respiratory group. So this dorsal respiratory group will be triggered or inspired by this aneuptic center. So in this way, aneuptic center increases the inspiratory activities, or otherwise we can say prolongs the inspiration act. And it receives inhibitory signals from this pneumotoxic center and inhibitory impulses to expiratory center. So this inhibitory signals coming from this pneumotoxic center will be sent to this expiratory center, which is present in the ventral respiratory group. So next, high centers are voluntary centers, voluntary control. So this voluntary control center is present in the cerebral hemispheres. So they are under the control of our will. So the pathways from this cerebral cortex will be passed to this respiratory muscles through this medullary neurons. So the neurons, so this blue line, so the neurons coming from this uh, what this cerebral cortex are voluntary respiratory center. So the neurons coming from this voluntary respiratory center, they will pass through this ventral respiratory group and dorsal respiratory group. So, and these centers are affected by the emotions and pain situations. So coming to the normal breathing cycle. So normal breathing cycle usually it lasts for around 5 seconds, and inhalation in the takes place in first 2 seconds, and later 3 seconds during the later 3 seconds exhalation takes place. So in the inhalation during the first stage, the dorsal group of neurons, they will stimulate the aneuptic center. They will be stimulated by the aneuptic center. So, and this stimulation by this aneuptic center results in the enhancement of inspiratory muscle act. So that's why inhalation takes place. And in the later 3 seconds, exhalation process takes place. So during this condition, during this phase, the pneumotoxic center inhibits the aneuptic center, so it results in the unstimulated dorsal group. So when dorsal group becomes unstimulated, it will stop the inhalation process, and automatically that results in the passive exhalation. So exhalation takes place passively under normal conditions. And forced breathing cycle. During forced breathing cycle, what happens? Cooperation of respiratory centers modifies during the forced breathing cycle. So in inhalation, both DRG and inspiratory centers of ventral respiratory group, both these two groups also stimulate the contraction of inspiratory muscles. So under normal conditions, only DRG stimulates the inhalation process, but during forced breathing conditions, like when we are doing rigorous exercises, like when we are running fastly, under those circumstances, forced breathing will take place. So during forced breathing conditions, along with DRG, VRG also stimulate the inspiratory muscles, so that a fast, rapid breathing will take place during that condition. And exhalation during this forced breathing cycle, the dorsal group and inspiratory centers of the ventral group, they will be inhalated so that expiratory centers of only ventral respiratory group will stimulate the control of expiratory muscles during the forced so coming to this chemoreceptors, so these chemoreceptors, they will chemoreceptors can be classified into two central chemoreceptors and one is another one is peripheral chemoreceptors. So in central chemoreceptors, they are located. The central chemoreceptors are located in the ventrolateral surface of the medulla. In the medulla oblongata part, the central receptors are there. These central receptors are stimulated by the changes in the pH and cerebrospinal CSF. So the central receptors, they will identify the changes in the chemicals in the body fluids or pH changes in our body by identifying the pH changes in the body fluids, especially in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. These central chemoreceptors, they will identify that the oxygen concentration and carbon dioxide concentrations are not normal inside the body. So depending on the situation, they will increase or they will decrease the respiratory movements to meet the uh, demand. And in peripheral chemoreceptors, in peripheral chemoreceptions, the receptors which receive the changes in the carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH changes, the key peripheral chemoreceptors are there. These peripheral chemoreceptors are located mainly in regions. They are aortic body and carotid bodies. And they will indirectly respond to the carbon dioxide concentration, but they will directly uh, react to this oxygen concentration and pH changes. So during this central chemoreception, what happens? Increased carbon dioxide partial pressure and increased pH will be detected by the cerebrospinal fluid. So in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is present inside this medulla oblongata and brain, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and increased pH will be detected by this central chemoreceptors. So the central chemoreceptors, they are present in this medulla oblongata part. So they will detect these changes in this increased carbon dioxide partial pressure and increased pH. So when carbon dioxide increases, what happens? This reacts with water to give rise to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. When hydrogen ions are increased, pH value will be increased. So during this condition, stimulation of DRG takes place, and this stimulation of DRG results in this increased respiratory rate and carbon dioxide field. When respiratory rate is increased, more carbon dioxide will be sent out of the body. And PCO2 has a potent acute effect but weak chronic effect. So in the peripheral chemoreceptors, they are located in two regions, as we have already said. This one is aortic bodies at this aortic arch, and the second one is carotid body at the base of this carotid arteries. So in these two regions, special receptors are there. They take the changes in the PO2 and PCO2. They also detect the changes in the pH and the perfusion pressure. So in this way, by detecting the changes in the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide and changes in the pH and changes in the perfusion pressure, so these two aortic bodies and carotid bodies, they will send the signals through this vagus nerve and glossopharyngeal nerve to this medulla oblongata. By receiving these signals accordingly in the medulla oblongata, dorsal respiratory group and ventral respiratory group, they will become activated and they will control the respiratory movement. So when there is a need, they will increase the respiratory need. When there is no need, they will decrease the rate of respiration. So in this way, the respiratory movements are controlled in our body. So this topic is over. We'll meet in the next class with another topic. Thank you.